So remember when everyone wanted to move to Denver? Yeah, that didn't age well, did it? What was once the land of endless sunshine, legal herbs, and mountain views has turned into a cautionary tale about what happens when a city grows too fast and forgets to plan. Traffic nightmares, real estate prices are a joke, and homeless is through the roof. And downtown feels like the set of a dystopian Netflix series where an accountant named Irving is definitely getting stabbed. Yes, it's one of those horror stories. Today we're diving into how Denver, like Portland, Oregon, went from one of the most moved to cities in the United States to a place locals are now leaving. We'll talk about the skyrocketing costs, mental health struggles, broken infrastructure, and how the mile-high city hit rock bottom, slowly, painfully, and in full view of everyone. Grab a drink, maybe one of those overpriced craft beers Denver's still clinging on to, and let's unpack this mess. Got it? Get it? Good. Let's take a look. The early 2000s, back when everyone was still figuring out MySpace and Denver was quietly becoming one of the most desirable places in the country to move to. Why? Well, you had gorgeous mountains in your backyard, a laid-back culture, and a cost of living that, brace yourself, was actually affordable. It wasn't uncommon to find a cute bungalow in a Denver suburb for under $200,000. Try not to cry if you're living in Denver right now. It's insane. Denver started popping up on all those best cities to live in lists around 2005. People from California and the Midwest began eyeing the city like it was the new Portland, except with more sunshine and fewer ironic mustaches at first. Then came 2012, the year that would change everything. Denver became the epicenter for the herb culture after Colorado legalized the recreational stuff in 2012. Saying different words because I'm trying not to get demonetized. But suddenly it wasn't just outdoorsy types moving in. It was the hippie types, entrepreneurs, investors, and influencers looking to capture that Rocky Mountain high without getting hassled by the man. The city's population exploded. Denver was one of the fastest growing metro areas in the country. And guess what happens when a lot of people move into a place without building enough homes? That's right, rent and home prices went full rocket ship. A one-bedroom apartment cost about $800 in 2010 was now pushing $1,400. Homes that were once affordable for teachers, nurses, suddenly needed tech bro income levels. And those tech bros, they were coming in hot from places like San Francisco, bringing their startup cash and Zillow alerts with them. Meanwhile, the city's infrastructure and social services were already feeling the pressure. And it just got worse. The honeymoon is over, and Denver forgot to do the dishes. By 2016, Denver wasn't just the cool kid on the block, it was a block party. Breweries were everywhere. Bike lanes were getting painted like they're going out of style. Millennials were flooding in faster than you could say IPA with a hint of pine and regret. But underneath all that rooftop brunch energy, the city was starting to buckle. And nobody addressed it. Let's start with the traffic. Because holy gridlock, Denver once was a breeze to navigate, had turned into a daily car-based nightmare. I-25 was now a parking lot with ambition. And Broadway felt like a Mad Max audition during rush hour. And don't even get people started on the light rail, an expensive, underperforming system that somehow managed to feel both empty and unreliable. Housing? That's where things really got weird. The city's population had grown by over 100,000 residents since 2010, but the housing supply was still crawling behind like it was stuck in a snowstorm in the Eisenhower Tunnel. Investors and developers focused on luxury condos because that's where the big money was. The result? A glut of high-end apartments and almost nothing for the middle class. Or the working class. Or, God forbid, anyone earning under $50,000 a year. Yes, it was that brutal. Denver used to be affordable and desirable. Now it was unaffordable, still desirable. Suddenly, Denver wasn't just a cool place to live, it was a cool place to try and survive. The American dream was starting to look more like a Craigslist rental scam. As rent spiked and starter homes disappeared, people who had been in the city for decades started getting priced out. Teachers, service workers, artists, the people who gave the place character were forced to move to distant suburbs like Aurora, Thornton, and Greeley. No offense to Greeley, but you smell like cows and broken dreams. It wasn't just about affordability, it was about visible change. That same year, 2016, Denver saw its first real wave of noticeable homelessness. I mean, it had always been there. Not saying it wasn't, it had always been there. But this is when it got supercharged and got a little crazy, much like Portland and a handful of other cities. Encampments started showing up where they hadn't been before. Sure, you had one or two people here or there, but these were full-blown encampments near Coors Field, Civic Center Park, and the Santa Fe Art District. These weren't isolated flukes, they were warning signs, the kind that city officials respond to with a lot of talk and not really enough action. The downtown area, once the crown jewel of Denver's revitalization efforts in the early 2000s, started to feel sort of off. The shine was fading. You still had Union Station, sure, that was always nice, and a few other places that were trying their best, but something about the atmosphere had shifted. Tourists still came, but they started to ask questions. Why are there so many tents? Is this normal? Where did all the storefronts go? And the locals, they started to notice too. The charm that once made downtown walkable and welcoming was giving way to a weird blend of street-level chaos. A $6 coffee shop on one corner and a makeshift camp under a tarp on the other. Meanwhile, the city's budget was being stretched thinner than a tortilla at a hipster taco truck. Denver was spending more on temporary shelter programs, police sweeps, mental health outreach, and emergency cleanups. But it wasn't building a permanent solution. It was like trying to fix a leaky dam with duct tape and optimistic speeches. One of the key failures? The city didn't increase its affordable housing stock in any manageable way. There were a lot of planning meetings, a lot of blue ribbon task force, but at the end of the day, not nearly enough shovels hit the dirt. And while the luxury apartments got green lit in record time, housing for people earning, let's say $40,000 or less a year, were hit with red tape, community opposition, translate not in my backyard syndrome, but they were stalling all the affordable housing projects. So here was Denver, booming on paper, but burning at the edges. You could still go hiking, still drink world-class craft beer, still see a show at Red Rocks, but you couldn't ignore that Denver had become a city that a lot of people wanted to live in, and fewer people actually could. And then came 2020. And if you thought the cracks were big before, they were about to become canyons. The COVID-19 pandemic didn't flatten Denver, it just peeled back the drywall like a flipped house with great curb appeal, but a crumbling foundation. Denver had long been skating on image and momentum. But when the lockdown hit and the tourists disappeared, the city's problems didn't just get worse, they became impossible to ignore. Let's start with the jobs. Denver's economy was heavily reliant on service industries. Hotels, restaurants, bars, tourism, the live entertainment. All of it came to a screeching halt in March of 2020. No Rockies games, no Red Rock concerts, no beer festivals, just empty streets and a lot of boarded up windows. If you worked in hospitality or retail, you probably got laid off. And if you were living paycheck to paycheck, like thousands were, that meant you were now dangerously close to losing your home. And lose homes? They did. By the end of 2020, evictions, once temporarily frozen, came flooding back as protections expired. Stimulus checks ran dry, rent relief programs were a bureaucratic nightmare, and while wealthier residents worked remotely in their condos, thousands of others were sleeping in their cars, or worse, on the sidewalks. And in Denver, those sidewalks weren't just in some neglected industrial zone. The camps were everywhere, outside the Capitol, near Union Station, across from high-end restaurants where you could pay $18 for avocado toast while staring at someone cooking ramen on a camp stove 10 feet away. Yeah, it was bad. Now, before you go on and say that the homeless didn't show up because of affordability and housing or anything like that, you're right. A majority of them were there because they had addiction and mental health problems. This was just another layer on top of what they were already dealing with before the pandemic. So you had your normal homeless, which that sounds kind of weird saying, but the typical homeless, and then you have this new working homeless that had to live in their cars because they couldn't afford a place. You know, that's become a big problem that is often overlooked because these people are still working and they might not be getting handouts, but they're living in their cars because they can't afford rent here. That's happened in Portland. It's happened in Austin. That's happened in Los Angeles. It's happened in Miami in a big way. Jacksonville, they've all got it. Denver responded like a city in crisis, but not the way you'd hope. It deployed what I like to call the whack-a-mole strategy. Clear a homeless camp here, and 2 more pop up over there. Sweep the sidewalks, post a sign, and then act surprised when people with no homes relocated next to unguarded patches of pavement. Rinse and repeat. All this did was shuffle the problem around like trash in a strong wind. And here's the kicker. Despite the influx of federal COVID relief funds, despite budget reallocation, despite endless promises from city officials, Denver didn't build nearly enough affordable housing. The projects that were funded took years to get off the ground, and by the time the ribbon-cutting ceremony happened, the wait lists were a mile long. Meanwhile, mental health care in Colorado quietly hit rock bottom. By 2021, the state ranked in the bottom 10 for access to mental health services. This wasn't new. Colorado had been underfunding behavioral health for decades, but the pandemic turned it into a full-blown crisis. Emergency rooms became de facto psychiatric wards. Police were called to do wellness checks they weren't trained for, and many of the people on the streets, they weren't just homeless, they were suffering from untreated mental illness, substance use disorder, or both. The opioid crisis morphed into the fentanyl crisis, and overdoses spiked. It wasn't uncommon to see Narcan being administered on the sidewalk in broad daylight. Parents walking their kids to school had to explain why someone was passed out under a blanket outside the coffee shop they just got a bagel from. And through all this, the city kept growing, or trying to. New high-rise condos went up, luxury apartments advertised rooftop hot tubs and dog spas, but affordable units were as rare as parking spots downtown. The divide between the haves and the have-nots became a canyon. What's worse is how slowly the narrative changed. For a while, local media outlets were still clinging on to Denver's shiny reputation, but eventually, the disconnect became impossible to deny. Tourists started writing Yelp reviews about stepping over needles outside their hotels. Convention organizers looked elsewhere. Residents stopped going downtown unless they absolutely had to. And even then, they didn't linger. They did what they had to do, and they headed home. So no, the pandemic didn't destroy Denver, it exposed it. And once it all cracked open, Denver found itself looking down the barrel of a homeless epidemic, a housing shortage, and a mental health collapse, all at the same time. And here's the part nobody wants to admit. The city still hasn't recovered. Now accepting applications, millionaires, trust fund kids, and the willfully delusional. By 2023, living in Denver was starting to feel like trying to win lottery just to afford a parking space, let alone an actual house. The average home value in the city danced just under $600,000, which sounds fine if you're relocating from, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and completely psychotic if you're a barista trying to split rent with 3 roommates and a large dog named Kevin. You know why they call him Kevin? Because he gets left home alone all the time. Because they got to work 3 jobs just to afford rent. And we're not talking about buying a house in some shiny, amenity-stuffed luxury development. No. We're talking about basic, older homes, sometimes on sketchy blocks, where the biggest feature was already being zoned for 3 burglaries a year. For $600,000, you might get a 2-bedroom fixer-upper from the 1950s, asbestos included, nestled between a craft brewery and a tire fire. Renters, of course, didn't get a break either. A decent 1-bedroom apartment inside Denver proper hovered around $1,900 a month. And that's not including utilities, parking, or the psychological toll of knowing your downstairs neighbor is an aspiring DJ and likes to practice his new skill at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Rent inflation was a citywide pandemic all its own, and there was no vaccine in sight. Meanwhile, wages sat there like a bored security guard, doing nothing. Service industry workers, delivery drivers, retail employees, all the people who actually keep the city functioning were getting pushed further and further out, both geographically and financially. It became common for teachers to commute from over an hour away, and by common, I mean required, because they literally couldn't afford to live in the same zip code as the schools they worked at. And no, commuting didn't become more convenient. I-70 was still a nightmare. I-25 made you question your life choices. Public transit still functioned on what can only be described as a vibes-based schedule. So people did what people do when math stops making sense. They left. Denver, once the poster child for migration, the city that had moving trucks lined up like it was Coachella for real estate, suddenly started bleeding residents, longtime residents. People were still moving in, but the locals, they'd pretty much been gone. For the first time in over a decade, it wasn't the place to be. It was a place to leave, quickly before your rent got jacked up again. Young families who came for mountain views and brewery patios were cashing out and moving on to places like Boise, Tulsa, and small towns in Texas, where they could get a 4-bedroom, a backyard, and a mortgage smaller than their old rent. Sure, tech workers with remote jobs and startup equity were still arriving, but the average middle-class American, they were done trying to make Denver work. It had become a luxury product disguised as a city, a place where the cost of living was on par with coastal metros, but without the salaries and the infrastructure to afford it. Denver wasn't just unaffordable, it was becoming unlivable for anyone who wasn't sitting on some serious cash or willing to embrace a lifestyle that included ramen dinners, 90-minute commutes, and the occasional catalytic converter theft. By the time 2024 rolled around, Colorado had proudly earned itself a spot in the club nobody wants to join, the bottom 5 states for overall mental health services. That's not just a random data point that some think tank tosses out to stir the pot. That's the lived reality of tens of thousands of Coloradans, many of them in Denver, who were dealing with addiction, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and a laundry list of undertreated disorders, all while the system basically shrugged. You know things are bad when we're ranked worse than Mississippi becomes part of the mental health conversation. In Denver, the cracks were everywhere, sometimes literal. The city streets were an unreal contrast, shiny new apartment towers next to people in deep crisis, talking to the air, curled up under a blanket, or pacing aimlessly. And no, they weren't just lazy drug addicts, as social media commenters love to declare from their HOA-covered suburban fortresses. Many were mentally ill and completely unsupported. No, I know a lot of you like to have these comments about drug addicts and, mental health. They're just, this, put them in a camp someplace, something like that. You don't know if you're not going to be the next person that has a mental breakdown and ends up on the street. Nobody does, okay? There was a genius living by my house when I was growing up who snapped at work and just made himself homeless, walked away from his, at the time, probably a $400,000 home. This was back in the 90s, so that was a lot of money in Los Angeles. And he just snapped. He just mentally snapped. He was a mathematical genius and couldn't take it. He ended up on the street with all kinds of mental problems. So if you act like, oh, well, they're this, that, you could be the next person. So stop. I get those comments all the time. And it's really irritating because you can just tell they're not educated enough about the subject to really make a decent argument about the situation. And if you think drug addiction is just someone making stupid choices, maybe in the beginning, but it is an addiction. And an addiction is a mental health problem. Nobody can escape it. Sometimes they do if they get the help they need. Anyway, the fentanyl crisis didn't just hit Denver, it gut-punched the city and walked off like it didn't care. Overdose deaths spiked in 2022 and 2023. EMTs and cops were administering Narcan so frequently it became routine, like handing out parking tickets or giving directions to lost tourists. At one point, it wasn't unusual to see someone overdosing in broad daylight in the middle of Civic Center Park, while joggers, dog walkers, and food trucks went about their business like it was the new normal. And it kind of was. And that downtown vibe, remember when Denver's urban core was a destination? Restaurants, rooftop patios, galleries, nightlife? Yeah, that was fading fast. By 2024, some of the restaurants had either shuttered or gone into full bunker mode. Limited hours, security guards, or locked bathrooms with a keypad entry. A few even posted signs like, restrooms are for paying customers only, no exceptions. And the less subtle ones said, no drugs, seriously. The city leaders tried to respond. To their credit, they didn't sit on their hands entirely. Millions were poured into programs, mental health response teams, crisis outreach vans, temporary shelters, even some tiny home villages. There was campaigns about mental wellness and initiatives that looked great on a PowerPoint. But the result, let's call them uninspiring. Programs either didn't scale or weren't permanent. They got tangled up in bureaucratic nonsense. One mental health care center would open only to be completely overwhelmed in a matter of weeks. Wait lists for therapy and psychiatric care stretched out for months. If you were in crisis, you had a better chance of seeing a DJ at Red Rocks than a licensed professional in under 72 hours. Meanwhile, frontline workers, counselors, nurses, social workers were overworked and underpaid. Burnout was rampant, turnover was high, and even those who wanted to help often couldn't keep up with the volume of people in need. Denver at this point had all the problems of a big city: rising homelessness, drug use, mental health collapse, and growing public frustration. But very few of the responses fixed any of that. It wasn't New York, it wasn't LA, it was stuck somewhere in the middle. Not small enough to manage everything locally, not big enough to throw serious national weight behind the solution. And while the residents grumbled, tourists recoiled, and businesses quietly closed their doors, the city just drifted. Not towards resolution, towards crisis. Just in a miserable gray middle where nothing works quite right and no one knows how to fix it. By 2025, the national narrative around Denver had officially flipped. Remember when Denver was that shiny, happy place with mountain views, progressive vibes, and a beer scene that could make Portland's blush? Yeah, those were about as dead as Blockbuster. Now, Denver had become the poster child for what happens when a city chases growth like a sugar-high toddler. No map, no brakes, and no idea what comes after the crash. National media started using Denver as a cautionary tale, the urban equivalent of "don't let this be you." It wasn't just local concern anymore, it was a red flag for every mid-sized city trying to scale up without a plan. A 2025 report estimated over 10,000 people experienced homelessness in the Denver metro area, with thousands more one paycheck away from joining them. Many were locals, people who grew up in Colorado, worked in its economy, and then got priced out of the housing market they helped build. And it's not like the city was doing nothing. They were doing a lot, just not a lot actually worked. Officials launched downtown beautification campaigns, opened up more shelters, and threw money in short-term programs like housing vouchers and rent assistance. But the big fix, the one that involved building actual affordable housing, expanding mental health care, and creating stable support networks, never quite happened. Or if it did, it happened so slow that no one noticed. The disconnect was wild. On one block, you could buy a $700 leather jacket at a boutique that called itself Artisan. On the next block, you could find a man sleeping under a blanket next to a dumpster with no access to a working bathroom or medical care. That's not a downtown revival, that's gentrification cosplay, and people noticed. The promise that drew thousands to Denver in 2010, a better life, cheaper alternative to California, a cool city with access to nature, had curled. People who had moved here for opportunity now felt stuck in a city that they didn't want to be in anymore. Public transit was unreliable, crime rates were creeping up, mental health services were overwhelmed, affordable housing was a fairy tale unless you could sleep in your car, and the social safety net, it had more holes in it than a ski lift punch card. In short, Denver wasn't thriving, it was surviving, barely, and a lot of its residents were getting tired of surviving. People started leaving, not in a dramatic mass exodus sort of way, but a slow trickle. Families cashing out their overpriced homes ended up in Des Moines. Young professionals who once bragged about moving to Denver now told their friends not to bother. And honestly, that hurt more than any article from the New York Times, some Reddit thread titled "Why Denver Sucks Now," because it came from within. The dream of Denver, laid back, livable, affordable, scenic, had faded into something else entirely. So yeah, in 2025, Mile High felt more like rock bottom. Now what? 2026 right around the corner. Denver didn't fall in a day. It fell slowly through neglect, poor planning, short-term fixes, and the myth that vibe alone can carry a city through a crisis. It leaned too heavily on image and not enough on resolution, much like Portland did. Could it come back? Yeah, I'm sure it will. But it's going to take more than legal herbs and craft beer festivals this time. It's going to take real investment in mental health housing and a long, hard look at how a city can handle growth. Until then, Denver remains a cautionary tale. Once a dream destination, now haunted by its own success. All right, everyone, that's today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great day be nice to each other.